Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. I am Bassem Michael. I'm the founder and owner of Only for Dentists. We're a dental CPA firm. We work with about 200 dental practices in about 15 states. We are based in beautiful California. And today we're going to be discussing a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. It's understanding dental valuations, and how practices are priced in today's market. I do have extensive training in valuation. I am a certified valuation analyst. I'm a CVA. I have valued multiple practices. I've testified in court with partner disputes and divorce cases about valuation of dental practices. And I also took private equity courses at Wharton's related to practices that are transitioning um, uh, um, by selling to a DSO. So I've done a lot of extensive work on helping clients both on the buy side and the sell side, selling to doing regular transitions or doing the strategic type of transitions that require strategic valuations. So that's a little background about myself. I'm so happy to have you join us today. And with that, let's get started. So today we're going to be covering what actually determines a dental practice value, why collections don't determine valuation, um, the financial metrics buyers focus on, and how preparation impacts exit outcomes. Um, Ideally, when when I'm helping clients prepare for an exit, we want to be doing this not 6 months before or not 3 months before. We want to be preparing for this probably 2 to 3 years before. So preparation is key to getting maximum valuation for your practice. And I am also very happy to say that I have a few dental advisors and dental professionals that work in the dental field, from practice brokers to former practice finance people and even practice consultants here with us today. And I would be really interested to hear them chime in and also give me their thoughts. So I want this to be more of a collaborative approach. We're not a very big group. We're under 20 people, so it should be nice and cozy, and we should be able to all learn from each other. So I welcome if you guys have to give me feedback or questions, I'll be more than happy to pause and answer your questions. We are going to be respectful of your time, so we will be out of here by noon Pacific or 3 Eastern. So the core reality of dental valuation is that dental practice value is driven by earnings and normalized earnings and operational discipline. So there's always a misconception, and again, the brokers here in the room can probably testify to that, that it's not always that benchmark, 75% of collections or 80% of collections. That's not really the core valuation metric. So it's not collections, it's not emotional attachment. Everyone thinks their practice is worth a lot more than probably it really is. Or sometimes, there are cases where people undervalue their practice, right? And then there's timing. Like I think the last 10 years, we've seen an uptick in DSO acquisitions and higher multiples. But I can tell you, last year, I've actually seen some deleveraging by DSOs. Some national big DSOs, we've seen them sell and shed off some of their practices in California and other states. We've done a couple in California, we've done a couple in the South, representing buyers. And it was, really interesting to see that DSOs are selling some of their locations now. They're not really on that big binge they were on a few years back. For the practice advisors and brokers in the room, are you guys seeing the same trend as well? I think I see some heads nodding, so that's. I think you kind of agree with me.
Yeah, Bassam, this is Phil with Western
Phil?
Practice Sales. Yeah, I think you're spot on when you're talking about some of these larger corporations. There's been some slowdown there with the DSO and that model. Um, the larger corporations are not buying as rapidly or as they're as hungry to get into the California marketplace. And we are seeing a lot in our regional footprint, though, where the multiple practice owners, and it's probably something you're going to be talking about later in this presentation, so I don't want to steal your thunder. But the regional practice owners, we're calling like a mini DSO, having
Yes.
4 or 5 opportunities, 8 to 10. No, there's still a lot of value there in that space, where banks are the willingness to work with those people because there's a lot of flexibility. That market's still okay in the California
Yeah.
marketplace, but so yes, I agree with you, Bassam.
Great. Thank you for your feedback, and you're definitely, in the market, you're in the weeds, and you see this day to day. So I appreciate that feedback. Um, so there are 6 drivers that we identified that drive the practice value. Um, Normalized earnings is probably the big one. And we're gonna define what normalized earnings is later on. The other thing is sustained performance. Buyers want to see that the practice is steadily growing, not flatlining and definitely not declining. Um, it's transferable, especially when you're doing more of the strategic deals. And I don't know if you guys know the difference between a normal transition and a strategic transition. So basically, a strategic transition is going to be probably a larger buyer who can value your practice at a much higher valuable multiple than you would be if you were selling it to in a private deal. The deal structure as well, and purchase price allocation, the operational discipline. Are there systems in place, or is everything done by the seller? You know, and then data visibility. Like, do you have information that you can support the valuation, and can you provide that data to the buyer as they're doing their due diligence, right? So um, these drivers really influence the valuation. And at the end of the day, in order for the deal to go through, the buyer has to feel confident and feel good that, hey, I'm going to be doing well, I'm going to be successful, right? So um, these things will definitely improve the psychology, both on the buyer and the seller end as well. So, what is normalized earnings? I know that term gets thrown around a lot. And in any merger and acquisition deal, uh, the most important thing is the adjustments. That's what we call normalization adjustments. That's where we basically adjust the financial statements to identify the true economic benefit and profitability in the practice. Because as we know, like in all the closely held companies, right, um, We include planes, trains, and automobiles, right? Sometimes we add family payroll. They may be working, but in the practice, but we still maybe pay them different than what we would pay a normal employee. We run maybe we choose to take our CE in Europe or Hawaii instead of taking it in in our local dental society chapter. Sometimes we could have one-time non-recurring expense, right? Let's One example of that would be maybe getting legal representation for maybe an employment claim or maybe paying a recruiter, right, to recruit a new associate. I mean, these are all one-time adjustments. Depreciation and amortization is another thing we add back. Interest expense. But the biggest, I think, delta is going to be the owner compensation normalization, right? Because most practitioners don't pay themselves a fair compensation. They don't pay themselves what an associate would get paid to make the same production, right? So it's very important in when we're figuring out the normalization that we go through all of these adjustments. Hey, what would if we were to replace the seller with an associate? How much would that associate cost, right? And then we would add back the owner's salary and then subtract what the associate is. And that's for, again, more of a strategic deal. For the smaller deals or the private deals, then we look at a different variable. We look at SDE, and that's basically what the seller's disposable earnings are. So that's a different variable that we look at. Let me pause here for a second. Hopefully, I'm not throwing too many terms or too much jargon. Do I need to slow down, or are we doing really good here? Is this pretty clear? I
Good for
see
me.
heads nodding. That's good. That's good. All right. So why collections alone don't determine value? Very simple. I can give you an example. Two practices may both collect 1.5, but they may have completely different valuations. And the difference is going to be driven by the profit margins, the owner compensation, the expense structure, and the operational discipline. Does that one practice have better systems than the other? Of course, there's other variables like location, the tenure of the employees, also how much renovation is going to be required after post sale by the buyer, right? These are things that can determine what part of the spectrum, valuation spectrum, you're going to be on. There's usually a range of value, right? And you might be at the top of the range if you check all the boxes. You might be in the middle or at the bottom of the range if some of these things are not checked off. So, in valuation of dental practices, there are two different benchmarks that are used for valuation multiples. And that's probably where I'm going to need also some feedback from the brokers in the room and the finance people in the room. There is seller's discretionary earnings, SDE, and that's really commonly used for private dental transitions. And then there's EBITDA. So the EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. It's often used in larger transactions where the buyer type, and really the buyer type will determine the metric. Phil, am I right on that, or are you seeing EBITDA also determine private dental practice transactions?
Bassam, you're throwing out a lot of key words that a lot of buyers are using in the marketplace and bringing to the table, both in private and in the smaller private sales. And when we start talking about EBITDA, you actually seeing the real true profitability, and you're not including the owner's comp, like you're saying. It's like that's part of the expense bottom or top line information that you're showing. It's like, oh wow, it's the profitability kind of scares you a little bit, but when you go back into the discretionary income and you're seeing the profitability jump up to 30-40% of gross revenues, the eyes are opening. So all of your key words that you're saying, Bassam, are true to this day. A lot of the buyers that are out there in the buying pool today are using them and they have advisors advising on them, but you definitely need more education on these keywords is fundamental today to making good business decisions in their acquisition or in a transition that they're looking at. And sometimes they confuse them. And it's best maybe just to stay in the path that they understand, which I would tell you, and the majority of the deals that we do, we start in our basis and our foundations is the discretionary income.
Yeah.
And then look at the other avenues. But if we stick with discretionary, more times than not, we get a real good picture of what we're trying to accomplish.
Because at the end of the day, the deal has to make sense, not just for the seller and the buyer, but for also the bank who's underwriting the deal. So it all has to pencil out, or whoever's going to write the check. So a lot of times that also plays a big factor. But thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So it sounds like in most private dental practice transactions, you're still doing discretionary earnings.
That's so true, Bassam. And I love one of your bullet points in one of the first slides of the 6 fundamentals is the operational discipline and the visibility. That is so important in today's market that, like you said, the banks know what they're looking for, and they're looking for historical operational discipline and visibility. And to be able to engage sellers or even buyers to look at the historical value of those numbers, there's real value in keeping your books clean. Real value.
Absolutely. Because again, we need to make the buyer and the bank feel good about the numbers we're presenting, right? They need to feel like it's reliable and it's consistent with what they can expect moving forward. Because at the end of the day, you know what the definition of enterprise value or business value? It's basically the future cash flows of that business. So that's really what people are paying money for, right? So they're not paying money for the equipment. They're not paying money for the patient records. They're paying money for the future cash flow. So just like Phil was saying, that since the profit margins on SDE could range anywhere between 35 to 40%, or sometimes even higher, the multiple is going to be roughly, again, I do valuations, and roughly what we see in private transactions, because I have access to that database, it's between 1.8 to 2.5. Is that right or wrong, Phil? Is that what you also see, or?
Markets determine locations, leases. There's a lot of other factors that go into it, but you're pretty much spot on. 1.5 to 2.25 to 2.5. Again, it just matters location, and there's other factors, and I'm sure
cash flow.
And
right?
cash flow is king.
Cash flow the deal has to pencil out. I'll tell you, one of the things I learned in my CVA training is that we have to do a sanity check after each valuation. We have to see if the value that we assign makes sense. Otherwise it's just a subjective number, right? So it has to make sense, and it's what a willing buyer and a willing seller are willing to transact at. That's what fair market value is. So because SDE multiples, or because SDE margins are higher than EBITDA margins, SDE, like we said, it was around 35 to 40% or sometimes higher. The multiple are going to be lower. EBITDA multiple, the EBITDA factors in replacing the owner doctor salary. So we subtract what the fair reasonable salary would be for the doctor, for the seller's production. And therefore, EBITDA is usually 15 to probably 20%. 20% is a really good number for EBITDA, right? That's kind of like the the this is where everyone wants to be, is at 20%. But more often than not, it's somewhere between 15 to 20%. So it's almost less than half of what SDE is. So that's why it would make sense that the multiple would be twice as much. But at the end of the day, aside, if we're doing a normal private transaction, the values have to align and be very close, whether you're using an EBITDA multiple or an SDE multiple. It's only when you're doing a strategic type of transaction, that's like if you are running like a DSO, you have really good systems in place. The practice can run without the seller. Basically, it would be like a plug and play for the larger DSO that's buying. That's when you get to the 6+ multiples on EBITDA. And of course, the EBITDA has to be very large. It has to probably be over $1 million, right? Before you get to the multiples of 9 and above. We have seen it, but again, we're talking much larger EBITDA and much more structure, which I think usually precludes 90% of the practice transitions. So, but in general, given that range, right, there's a range of multiples. Higher multiple will basically come from lower risk for the buyer and the lender and stronger earnings. Operational discipline and transferability also drive multiples up. If the practice is not dependent on the seller and the transition is going to happen really quickly with no pain, I think it drives up the multiple. But if the doctor is doing everything, they're scheduling patients, they're doing the billing, they're doing everything, then this practice is dependent so much on the seller that it's probably going to drive the value down. Because you still have to normalize in a normal setting. The buyer is not going to be doing front office tasks. They're not going to be doing billing. They just want to be doing dentistry and maybe grow the practice. So we have to add back the salaries of additional front office people, for example. Does that make sense? Is that clear? I know sometimes EBITDA and SDE could be confusing, knowing the difference. And also, you start hearing about multiples of EBITDA, and maybe you're looking at a multiple of SD, and you feel like, oh, I'm getting paid half of what I should be paid, but we're not really looking at apples versus apples. It's oranges and apples. So I hope I made that clear. Driver two.
Bassem, real quick, we do have a question in the chat. How often do you see SDE valuation higher than the EBITDA valuation?
That's a really good question. Let me see here. Phil, have you seen that where the SDE valuation could come higher?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at EBITDA valuations, these are economies of scale type businesses, like Bassem was saying earlier, where EBITDA's, when you look at an EBITDA, you got to charge back things like hygienist work and so, like, it's just a much more complicated formula. But like on a lower scale of a practice or revenue practice that's doing $600,000, it's very common that an SDE is going to be higher valuation than EBITDA, because on a $600,000 practice, it could be just one doctor, one hygienist, maybe two hygienists, an assistant, a front office. and it looks labor intensive. So that drives the profit on your tax return down to say 20, 50 grand. Well, 6 times 20 to 50 grand is only, 300,000 bucks, but the
Yeah.
practice is doing 600,000. If you do the basic math that we're talking about in EBITDA, or SDE, your owner doctor is probably making about 30% of that 600,000 right off the rip. So that's 180 grand of owner's compensation that we can adjust for, and you multiply that by 2, you're already at 360. So just basic math on a practice that is in that 500, 600, $700,000 range is your SDE is going to most likely be higher than any EBITDA. And that goes back to Bassam's point of these practices that are doing $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, multiple facilities. Those are the ones that really you're driving EBITDA numbers, and you're working with your tax advisors and your financial people well before any sort of investor is going to see that to drive EBITDA for multiple years. And that's the operational discipline and things that Bassam was talking about. In an SDE model, you need a good solid 18 months, 2 years to talk to your financial people and clean it up and make sure that owner's adjusted cash flow, SDE cash flow, is very present and available, because that's what the bank's going to lend on is 1 solid year of a tax return and at least a 9-month P&L, 6 to 9 month P&L. And if there's fundamentals there that make sense, then your SDE is absolutely going to outweigh your EBITDA valuation.
Right on, Phil. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much. And I'll just to kind of reframe it, if you're doing with hand dentistry and you're the main provider or producing more than 50% of the production, most likely you're a candidate of SDE, not EBITDA. If you're an absentee owner, then probably that's a good indication that you're more of your buyer type is going to be more of a DSO or another regional DSO, maybe not a Heartland, but maybe a local 5 or 6 location outfit that might be interested, and they can justify using EBITDA and the higher multiples. But the key is going to be transferability and operational discipline. They're basically looking for a plug and play model. These are typically the buyers that are going to be applying EBITDA and those larger EBITDA multiples. They're basically looking for a model where the practice is on cruise control. I hope that gives you some context. Are there any other questions, Tiffany, that we need to address so far? Or?
No, I think that also answered Gene's question also to summarize the SDE and how it's calculated.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Then you're welcome. There's also owner dependency risk, right? Practices heavily dependent on the owner receive discounted multiples. And the reason is, we see this, especially in really small practices. The seller is doing so much. They're doing all the hygiene. They're doing everything. That's why their salaries look so low compared to the industry, is that the owner is working 60, 70 hours a week, right? Or their spouse is working in the practice and they're not compensating their spouse, right? We have to add these things back, and these things will drive the value down. If income leaves with the doctor, the value decreases, right? I personally think practices where the hygienists are doing the hygiene and not the doctor, they're probably going to have a higher multiple, because even if the seller goes away, the faces that the patients are used to seeing, they're going to continue after the transition, right? So I think that reduces the risk for the buyer. Buyers evaluate whether the income will continue after the transition or not. Reducing owner dependency will definitely increase valuation. Also, preparation and exit quality, right? The difference between a good exit and a great exit usually involves 2 to 3 years of advanced preparation. I want all my clients and I want every professional that I come in contact with to have a great exit because it's not only going to help the seller, it's also going to help the buyer. It's going to just allow for a much smoother transaction and a much smoother transition. Buyers typically review 3 years of financial history, and lenders too, I think. Rushed sales lead to lower multiples and missed tax planning opportunities. So early preparation really strengthens your negotiation leverage, because you're preparing that package, financials and tax returns, so that someone like Mike or Phil, who can help you with the transition, can really market this practice, and a lender would look at it and say, oh yeah, sure, we can underwrite this deal. The third driver is sustained performance, right? So buyers want to see consistent production and collection trends, stable or improving profit margins. And that second point has been difficult to do the last few years because we're seeing practices under a lot of pressure on the collection side because of insurance reimbursements, right? The insurance reimbursements are not keeping up with the rising staff costs, the rising supply costs, right? The rising rents. So you need to be monitoring your overhead. You need to be monitoring your fee schedule. And if your practice hasn't updated their fee schedule in 10 years, that doesn't look good when you're getting ready to sell. So the buyer wants to see, and the lender also wants to see predictable revenues without large swings. Like sometimes I think having steady growth may be even better than having large growth in 1 year, because sometimes it could indicate, hey, you're just trying to manipulate your final year numbers to look good, right? Maybe, and that's where good buyers that know what they're doing, they're going to look at the charts, right? They're going to audit the charts and see if there's any work for them to be completed, or you've already done all the work, right? So no sudden drops or peaks also in revenues, and consistent performance over 2 to 3 years, basically, to recap it. So why timing matters? Timing matters because rushed sales, like we said earlier, leads to lower multiples. It reduces your negotiation leverage with the buyer and with the lender. It sometimes doesn't allow for optimizing the tax structure of the deal. And it could lower the buyer's confidence in the practice. If it's rushed, they're going to feel like there's more risk. So timing is everything, right? For a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers, sorry, over the years, I've come across some sellers that they're not selling at their peak. They're selling when the practice is starting to decline because they don't have the effort to grow the practice, and you don't want to ever do that. So preparation is going to be your highest value driver pre-sale. So when you sell during strong performance and consistent performance signals low risk for the buyer and the lender. Stable and improving margins, again, will command stronger valuations. It builds predictable revenue trends, which gives confidence and makes the buyers feel warm and fuzzy. And you could support your asking price and maybe command a really good price for it. And then we get to the fourth driver, right? It's operational discipline. And boy, are there so many emerging DSOs out there They went to their lawyers, they prepared their documents, they have their DSO documents. Legally, they look like a DSO, but operationally, they're they don't have the management depth and the discipline to really run it like a DSO. Um, so um, margins and operational structure influence the value, efficiency, keeping track of your overhead, payroll efficiency, like non-doctor compensation. So like hygienist, assistants, front office needs to be somewhere between 28 to 30% with benefits and taxes. Lab and supply costs, they need to be within industry benchmarks, each around 7%. Of course, so the practice is utilizing um, um, milling units and they're milling their own crowns, then we would expect lower lab fees. One thing we see all the time, and it's an easy valuation value driver, is selling doctors. They just get too comfortable with the labs they're working in. They're paying $250, $300 per crown, and it drives up their lab costs when maybe it's worth it, right? To find a comparable lab that will do the crown for $100. Most likely they're all using milling units. So, but some of us don't want the unknown or the discomfort of having to deal with a new lab because the lab that we're paying $250 to or $300 to, they just get the margins done so perfectly, and I don't have to redo it. But that could potentially affect your valuation quite a bit. Just to give you an example, right? If you're using an expensive lab, and I have nothing against labs, so I love labs, but we see this all the time. If you have $1 million practice and you're spending 10% on lab fees, right? So that means you're spending $100,000 on labs, and let's say you're paying $200 for the lab bills. That means and if you're spending $100,000, if you were to pay another lab $100 instead of $200, that means you could potentially save $50,000, right? So that 50,000, if you again prepped 1 or 2 years before, imagine adding $50,000 to your bottom line. What would that do to your valuation, right? If you're selling at a multiple of 2, that's 100,000 more in value, right? So you need to keep your overhead expense less than 60% of collections if looking at an SDE valuation. So buyers consider it more risky if your overhead is higher than the norm. And also, equipment deferred maintenance, if they're going to have to spend a couple $100,000 right off the bat, renovating the practice or buying new equipment, that could also affect the value range. What are your thoughts on that, Phil?
Those are great points, Bassem. And I guess start with like the lab fees. You need time in order to adjust to labs and supply fees. That's a 2 to 3 year window again, where you need to be talking to somebody to adjust to get the real value. If you are a seller in today's market and you come to me today and say, and I notice it right away, you're paying 10%. I'm like, you're way overpaying. And any buyer is going to see that too, which is actually at that point in time, if you're a seller, don't change anything, because then the buyer is going to say, there is an opportunity there where I can trim off 20, 30 grand and I'm making a little bit more, which makes this practice more palatable for me if I'm working on a thinner margin. So If the seller's coming to the table too late, don't change anything. And it gives a buyer an opportunity to win there, right? So
Yes.
that's a bonus that we present. We actually represent that to the buyers. Like, look, here's the opportunity, X, Y, and Z, and that's one of them. Same with equipment. Equipment's one of those things, it's a slippery slope. Nobody wants the old equipment. New buyers want the newest, fanciest, shiniest toys. And there's no denying that. But they want their own new fancy shiny toys.
Yeah.
If you were to put in knowing that your time horizon is 2 to 3 years in the future, that's okay. Make that investment, have your CPA depreciate it, take some tax advantages that potentially are there in a 2 to 3 year window. It will make your practice more attractive when it comes to sell. But don't do it if you're going to sell in 90 days from now. Most
Yes.
likely the buyer is going to want to make that investment themselves. And the great thing about that is the lenders out there are giving some of these first-time buyers money that we've never seen before. And if a CBCT is needed in order to do the implants that this person can do, more times than not, banks are willing to invest in that buyer to give them those tools to make them fully operational day one, because that's the lifeline. If the implants are whatever, Invisalign, if they need a scanner, whatever it is, more times than not, the buyers will have the capital post sale to invest in what they actually want. So this is definitely a conversation that needs to happen 2 to 3 years prior to selling. And if you wake up one day and you think you're going to sell, definitely have this conversation before you spend any money. So thanks, Bastian. That's a great
Absolutely.
lead-in.
Oh my gosh, that's probably the best pearl of wisdom I heard today, because some of the most painful things that I've seen in practicing, I've been practicing for over 20 years, is um, when a dentist at the end of their professional time horizon, um, they decide to sink in a couple $1 million um, to renovate the place, maybe expand the space, and buy new equipment. I think if you're planning to sell within 5 years, you're never going to recover that money. And because at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, having nice equipment may influence the value range, but it's not gonna, um, you're gonna get a small fraction of what you invest. So I would definitely not do something like that, and check with your accountant before you do anything like that. If you're at the last 5 years of your career, I would basically make sure that I get a good ROI on any investment that I make, because it's not gonna affect the valuation that much if you have a newer CBCT or one that's 10 years old or 15 years old. Um, and like Phil said, probably the buyer would rather get something that they want rather than you giving it to them. So, um, really good points here. Thank you so much. Um, I think just to kind of give you an idea, here's a quick example. If we're working together 2 or 3 years before, and by the way, like in our firm, we have this software called Practice Gauge we developed in-house. And our Practice Gauge doesn't just give you a dashboard to tell you how you've done historically. We actually benchmark you against the 300 other practices in our database. And we give you that real time. So that's an added bonus that clients get when they work with us, is they get these benchmarks. And by the way, we also calculate SDE with every monthly and quarterly report you get. We calculate EBITDA. So if you're planning an exit, I think this practice gauge would be a really good tool to have. We also look at cash flow. We look at all of these things. Um, so small operational improvement can compound to significant value. Um, so if on an SDE model, right, $100,000 improvement could add $220,000 if you're selling at a multiple of 2.2 when you're ready to sell. So these things can add a lot of value. The fifth driver is going to be the deal structure and taxes. The sales price alone doesn't determine your outcome. In a private transactions, right, most sellers will maybe transition for a couple of weeks and right into the sunset, right? So there is really not a whole lot of transition planning post sale that needs to be done. But this tends to also, the devil tends to be more in the details when you're doing the DSO transactions, because they're going to give you this beautiful pie in the sky number, right? And typically you're not going to realize all the money up front. That should probably be a topic on its own. So I'm not going to delve into much details into that, but we're going to focus on private transactions here, not DSO transactions. So most dental sales are going to be structured as an asset sale. And this is a painful area. Phil, probably you've seen that with, the seller's CPA, if they're not a dental CPA, because they're not dental focused, they're just so tax focused, they're going to come and ask for, oh, we need to do a stock sale, not an asset sale. Have you ever encountered that?
Absolutely. It happens more times than you want to know.
So avoid getting bad advice from non-experts, especially in the industry. So especially like in a highly litigious environment, like, you could have patients come and sue, former employees come and sue. No one is going to buy your entity. They're usually going to buy the assets. And so this is where the purchase price allocation is going to be very important. Goodwill, equipment, non-compete are all taxed differently. And your CPA should be involved before you sign that LOI. Because again, the devil is in the details. And that final after-tax number will probably depend a lot on the purchase price allocation. And I always advise clients on both the buyer side and the seller side that the allocation needs to be reasonable, right? And it should never make or break the deal. The tax tail should not wag the dog. But involve your CPA before signing the LOI. And make sure, again, you're getting good counsel from experts in the dental industry. So make sure you have a dental CPA and a dental attorney, because also non-dental attorneys can blow up deals. So if your neighbor is an attorney, but they're not dental specific, I highly recommend not to use someone who's not an expert, because they will stall the deal and they will probably focus on areas of concern that should not be an area of concern and maybe miss things that they should have completely focused on. And just touching on the purchase price allocation, goodwill is usually taxed at capital gains rates. So for the seller, that's advantageous, right? We want that. So we want most of the purchase price to be allocated to goodwill. But it's not reasonable to say, I'm going to get 100% of my proceeds in goodwill. That's just not reasonable, because that's part of the deal. The buyer is getting patient records, they're getting goodwill, they're getting covenant not to compete, they're getting equipment, right? And the fact that the equipment is in a going concern, in a running business, that probably makes the equipment worth more than if you were to go on eBay and buy used equipment. So the mere fact that the equipment is installed and it's operational, that gives it more value. It's worth more. Okay, so we need to be reasonable here. And from my experience in doing transitions, the deal has to make sense for both the buyer and the seller. Good transitions cannot be one-sided. It has to be a win-win. So need to have a reasonable amount in goodwill, reasonable amount in equipment. Now, the equipment is really advantageous for the buyer because they can write it off as Section 179 the first year. So you could see why they're fighting for that. But for the seller, all that depreciation that you took is going to be recaptured, and you're going to have to pay ordinary income on that. So that's also important for you. And it's important to reach a middle ground, right? Non-compete agreements, there needs to be an amount allocated to non-compete, but it should not be, again, a significant number. It should be a smaller amount. Typically, what do you see in your allocations, Phil? I typically see like $5,000 or $10,000 to non-competes. Do you see a much bigger number? I think you're muted. You're not coming through. But I was saying that typically we see $5,000 to $10,000 allocated to non-compete. I think I already highlighted why CPA involvement early matters. And then data visibility, right? How available is the information? So you need to show that you're managing by objectives and you're managing by data, not just by gut feeling. Don't just rely on the raw P&L statements alone, but rely also on your SDA calculations and EBITDA calculations. Do benchmarking, look at your different overhead benchmarks, make sure that you're below industry averages on that. Because to get the maximum valuation, there has to be financial clarity to reduce the risk for the buyer. So the key points that buyers examine, they really scrutinize your adjustments to reach the SDE or EBITDA. They look at your hygiene production as a percentage of total. They look at your overhead percentages for payroll, for lab, for supplies, for marketing. They'll ask you, how many new patients are you getting? They will look at all of these things. I know when we're representing buyers and helping them with the due diligence, these are all things that we look at. So benchmarking helps you and the buyer determine whether the margins support the stronger valuation. It shows how efficiently you're running the place. It could give early warning signs of valuation weaknesses. That's why you should do it early, like 2 or 3 years before. Where to focus your improvement efforts, where your data can reduce uncertainty for both the buyer and the lender. And it could give you a strong negotiation leverage, honestly. It also matters because practices that are on top of their overhead, they command stronger multiples. They price uncertainty into their offers, and clean financials with benchmarks reduce perceived risk. I think I repeated it multiple times, so I think you're getting the message here. With that, I know we have a very special guest with us. I have Curtis Crandall. I'm so glad Curtis is joining us today. Curtis is probably runs a really successful fortune management franchise on the East Coast. He is a practice owner, and I would say he's not just running a solo practice, but he's working on building his dental empire. So Curtis, I want you to briefly introduce yourself, and also tell us what are the biggest mistakes that you see exiting dentists make
Yeah.
that really undermine their valuation.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the introduction, Bassam, and including me on the conversation here. So, just to clarify with everyone, I am not a dentist, but I do own a few dental practices in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I coach another probably 50 offices with my coaches in Western PA, West Virginia, Ohio, and Indianapolis. But I would say the biggest mistake is that not paying attention to the numbers as you guys are talking about. Everything that you said is extremely important, Bassam, that, you're not thinking about these things at the 11th hour trying to get your practice ready for sale, but you are thinking, 24 to 36 months out, right? I love Practice Gauge. I utilize it in all my practices because what I think is super important, well, KPIs in general are important, but KPIs, right? Key performance indicators around how your practice is valued and observing your value over time, I think is very important. It's something that's missed a lot, right? At the end of the day, every practice has a story. I look at a business and a dental practice specifically as kind of like the bell curve of a human life, right? You've got a de novo that's at birth. You've got, early childhood. You've got teenage years. Then at the top of that bell curve is really the zone of optimization or maturity, right? And my goal with all of my clients and my practices in general is that when we get to that zone of optimization or maturity, that we just don't go down with that bell curve into death, right? Death or disabled, right? That's really where you're going to find yourself in a tough spot. And practice pretty much goes to very low value there, especially if you don't have associates in place. But you create that next arc of growth. Right. But you also do it in a way that's responsible and you're not investing money at the 11th hour either. You're not going to be able to recoup. I think all those things are important. I think if you're depending on what type of transition or what type of practice you have, I think something that can be overlooked for the smaller style practice that might have an associate is the associate contract, right? I just did a deal with a client and they bought a
Very good
practice and
point.
we really warned them on this. We said this is not a good deal. Like there's big red flags, and it was the fact they didn't have an associate contract. Somehow it just was never signed, or they talked about it, but they never got it. The guy dipped right at the closing. Now the person's without an associate, and they're kind of scrambling back and forth between two practices. So again, I think that the biggest thing I would point out is know where your practice falls on that bell curve, right?
Yeah.
Are you starting to go down the other side of it? If you are, turn the dials the direction they need to go in order to create that next arc of growth. Really, is probably what I would say.
Beautiful pearls of wisdom. Thank you,
Yeah,
Curtis. Curtis,
thanks.
how many acquisitions have you done?
Oh man, personally, probably. Oh man, I don't know. Probably 10 or 11. Some roll ups, right?
Yeah.
With my clients, though, I mean, probably 25 over the last 5 or 6 years. But I'm 41 next week, and I bought my first dental practice at 25 back in 2010. So over the course of that time frame, it's been a lot.
Well, you certainly have a really good story to tell.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And I value our friendship and our partnership as well. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
been a pleasure working with you and your partners and both on the side of Fortune and also in the practices. So
Yeah.
I enjoy the work that we do for you guys.
Likewise. Right back at you, buddy.
Um, so I think Curtis covered a lot of the things I was going to say in this slide, right? The common mistakes, right? Assuming high collections equals high value, or you're using that benchmark 75% of collections, but if there's no cash flow to support that, you're not getting the 75%.
Yep.
Waiting until burnout or urgency to sell, I think that's where you said, figuring out where you are on that curve, right? The life cycle of any enterprise or any business.
Yep.
Businesses are kind of like humans. We go through a life cycle. So
Yeah.
you need to be when it's still going up, not when it's declining. Ignoring the cleanup before going to market and delaying tax planning and not getting your advisors involved early on in the process. Like if you need to be building value, you should be working with Curtis or someone like Fortune, right? To help you build that. You need coaching, right?
Yep.
You should be talking to Phil and Mike 2 or 3 years before, and because they can tell you, oh, you know what, we need to focus on this, focus on that. And again, that's how you maximize and build value, right? It's very important. And I'll tell you another thing. You want to be working with an advisor that's not going to just tell you what you want to hear to get the listing or to get the advisory contract. You want to work with the advisor that's going to challenge you and really make you and make your practice a better version of itself from where it stands today, right? So we always tell clients that we're in many cases, we're not going to tell them what they want to hear, but we'll tell them what they should hear from an objective point of view, because sometimes you need to see that and you need to hear that.
Yeah.
You
Bassam,
brought
I
up,
got Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just got one more quick comment. I put it in the chat, but all these things that Bassam's talking about and Phil and we've been discussing here are very true statements, whether you're doing an all-out sale or if you're even bringing in a minority partner, right? You want to have your books set up extremely well, even almost better if you're bringing in a partner, because that person's going to be coming in and now living in your house with you. And if you haven't already cut out money for yourself for managing that business, if you're not paying yourself as an associate appropriately, if you're not taking profitability or profit, and the fourth way we like to have our doctors being paid is owning real estate. If you don't have those four things set up correctly, and you try and bring in a partner for 20%, 30, 49, whatever the percentage is, and you don't have that figured out for 2 to 3 years, it's going to be a much harder,
harder
less
sell.
attractive. Yeah, it's going to be harder to sell, a less attractive partnership for that person to be in. So,
Totally.
I know for me that formula is mission critical for bringing partners into my businesses.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. And the other point that you raised, which was not even on my slides and I totally missed it, is having a good associate contract. Like,
Yeah.
can you imagine a buyer is buying a practice and you have an associate, but there's no contract? And I know like covenants not to compete could not, may not be enforceable in the court of law. But guess what? You would have to litigate to figure that out.
Yep. Yep.
I would put the dang thing in any contract I would
Always
do.
put it in.
Right?
Yeah. And if you don't have the contract, the guy goes down the street and opens up at his own place, and now you bought this practice that everyone already knew the associate when they're going to be, most likely out the door.
Absolutely. You got to have those associate contracts. Um, well, very good. Very good points. Thank you for your input.
Sure.
So I think, the key takeaways here is that your strong dental valuations come from healthy earnings, transferable systems, and that reduce owner dependency, and clean financials and operational discipline. Just a final thought here. Buyers purchase predictable income streams. Practices with strong margins, transferable systems, and clean financials command stronger valuations. So that's a good way to end our conversation. Does anyone have any questions? And to our guests like Curtis, Mike, and Phil, do you guys have any comments that you want to maybe follow up on?
Basketball, while you guys were talking to, I was responding to a few of the questions that came up in the chat room. So if there's additional questions, they're asking about Delta Premier and goodwill ratios on the sale.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you, Phil, for doing that. I was kind of holding off till we had some time to answer those questions, but thank you so much for responding to those in the chat. I appreciate that.
Well, again, I want to be respectful of people's time. So if you have to go, we understand. But if we're on a roll and we have a good conversation going, we could stay and answer a few more questions. And because I want to make this educational, right? If people put in the time to come here and listen to us, we want them to take some good value out of this. So I'm okay to stay a few more minutes. If we have some unanswered questions. So Phil, go ahead and maybe share with us your wisdom on those questions that you answered in the chat.
Dr. Z was asking, one of the first questions I saw was, what additional reports do young buyers need to look at when they're engaging? And you can get as deep as you want or stay as high level as you want. I think the key report that I really hone in on, Dr. Z, is the production by provider / procedure.
Yeah.
You want to really look in and what type of dentistry is being done. Can I do that dentistry? Can I do it to that volume? And is there an opportunity to do more? And if you can answer those questions on that report, those two reports, then that's gonna answer your question whether this practice is the right fit or not. So I think that's the key report that I would say outside of a tax return and a P&L that you want to look at is production by procedures and then by provider. If there's multiple dentists in the space, you want to see who's doing what and where and why. But if you can do the dentistry, those reports are what's going to tell you. There's another question about Premier in California. I know that Curtis is in PA, so I don't know. Curtis, is Delta Premier a thing in Pittsburgh?
It's not as big of an issue. I know it's super heavy in California, having a lot of my Fortune coaches out there as well. So it's not as big, but we talk about it all the time. And if you're a seller and you're in Premier and 50% of your patient population is Delta, you got a little bit of an issue when you're trying to sell that practice because someone's going to buy it and they're not going to get Premier. And there's a pretty big difference between a Premier and the PPO fee schedule through Delta. I know we can't talk about it, but but there is. So.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about it, but it is the elephant in the room, and the
Yeah.
way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time.
That's right.
And you got to understand that the new buyers are coming out with new skill sets too. The PPO drives new patients. New patients give new opportunities. And then we're looking at prophy counts and we're looking at other metrics in an office that say, how many more at bats can a new potential buyer bring to the table and offer dentistry? And the PPO brings new patients. So you got to get more at bats to counteract that. And that's really the high level discussion. In terms of value, the question was about value. It's not a dollar for dollar value. Let's say you pull a 1099 of your Delta and 100,000 of it is you have a Delta 1099 that says 100 grand. Just basic math says you're probably going to take somewhere between a $15,000 to $25,000 haircut on what your fee reimbursement is going to be. And that's every management consulting buyer advocate team has their own calculation, and there's not an exact science to what that number actually is, but that's the number that you typically hear back is it's like a 15%-ish cut against whatever that 1099 is from the prior year. And one of the last questions I saw was the goodwill versus assets. Bassam, you can answer this too, but it's typically the jumping point is like 80-20, 80% goodwill, 20% assets. And then just
reasonable is. But again, we have to make room for maybe the equipment is only 2 years old, or we can, there's a range. I would say somewhere between 70-30 and 80-20.
Bassam, we did have another question also from Dennis asking, are you seeing more of a trend of newer dentists owning their practice or working as an associates with the DSO model being as big as it is?
We've done, Tiffany, you and I have done a lot of buyer representation as far as the due diligence so far this year. So I would say we're probably seeing, we're not seeing any change. We're, those who went to dental school to be an entrepreneur or a dentalpreneur, like we say, they're still going and acquiring practices. Some of them are even doing startups. So I don't know if that has changed a lot. Is that what you guys are seeing also, Curtis and Phil?
I apologize, Bassam. My Zoom just crashed, so I actually missed what you were even referring to, but I'll let Phil take this one.
Curtis, I think you're probably going to say the same thing, and I'm going to say is the buyers that want to buy are going to buy. And you definitely know the entrepreneurs, like you're saying, Bassam.
Yeah.
And I would tell you that the DSOs are actually giving us very good quality buyers. So they've worked the 5 days a week, 8-hour, 10-hour shifts, and they realize that they went to school for dentistry to have flexibility in life. The work-life balance is a real thing in dentistry. And when they see their friends and peers having that flexibility and freedom, by the time they hit their mid-30s, early 40s, they're looking for that too. And I would say that DSOs are actually helping us and supporting us by building a stronger buying pool into the private sector.
Right. And typically, the dentist that will work for a DSO with no equity interest, or sometimes there are good deals where they may work and become like a minority partner and they still can build value. But the people that will work for a DSO and they're happy, they would not be happy owning a practice anyway, right? Because it just takes a different personality to be a practice owner. I think it doesn't make the practice owner better or worse. It's what you want in life, and I think, fortunately for dentistry, I think still, I think there is great opportunities for dentists to own their own uh, business and grow an empire. Um, well, thank you so much for all your feedback, and did we answer all the questions?
I believe so. I believe we got them all.
All right, perfect. Well, I hope this was valuable to all our attendees. I want to thank our guests. You guys have definitely made this discussion more rich, and you added a lot of value. So I'm so glad you were able to make it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.